Welcome, 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 welcome to Reflections on Race. This is day 4, and I am Shante Charles. We are continuing in our reading, White Like Me, by Tim Wise, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. We are continuing the reading in terms of looking at Tim Wise's paternal side, the Wises, the European Jews, and he's continuing to tell us about his family. And he was saying that he has just discovered through a lecture that his family participated in the marginalization of Black and brown people in a different way than his maternal side. So that is what we're going to get into reading right now, and let us begin. It was only a few years ago during a workshop that I was attending, not as a facilitator, that I really became to appreciate the fact. During the session, we had all but been discussing our family histories, and at one point I mentioned almost as an afterthought that my comfort in and around communities of color likely stemmed from the fact that my paternal grandfather had owned and operated a business in the heart of Nashville's Black community for many years, an establishment I had visited dozens of times from when I had only been a small child until I was a teenager. As I was getting ready to leave, excuse me, I was interrupted by a Black man older than myself. I'm originally from North Nashville, he noted. What kind of business did he have? A liquor store, I responded. My family owned liquor stores all over town, and my grandfather's was on Jefferson Street. Your grandfather was Leo Wise? He replied, appearing to have known him well. Yes, he was. He was a good man, the stranger shot back. A very good man. But let me ask you something. Have you ever thought about what it means that such a good man was more or less a drug dealer in the ghetto? Time stood still for a second as I sought to recover from what felt like a serious punch to the gut. I could feel myself getting defensive, and the look in my eyes no doubt betrayed my hurt and even anger at the question. After all, this was not how I viewed my grandfather, as a drug dealer. He had been a businessman, I thought to myself, but even as I fumbled around for a reply, for a way to defend my grandfather's honor and good name, I began to realize that the man's statement had not been a condemnation of Leo Wise's humanity. It was not a curse upon the memory of the man to whom I had lovingly referred as Papa all of my life. Anyway, he was right. The fact is, my grandfather, who had spent several of his formative years living with his family on Jefferson Street, indeed made his living owning and operating a liquor store in the Black community. Though the drug he sold was a legal one, it was a drug nonetheless. And to deny that fact or ignore its implications that my grandfather put food on his family's table, thanks to the addictions or at least bad habits of some of the city's most marginalized Black folks, to shirk the responsibility that we all have to actually own our collaboration. His collaboration hadn't made him a bad person, mind you, just as the Black drug dealer in the same community is not necessarily a bad person. It simply meant he had been complex like all of us. Even the man who had raised the issue of my grandfather's career as a legal drug dealer was quick to point out the other side, how he had seen and heard of Leo paying people's light bills, phone bills, hundreds of times paying folks' rents, 100 more, how he paid to get people's car fixed or brought families food when they didn't have any, how he paid people under the table for hauling boxes away, moving liquor around, or delivering it somewhere, even when he could have done it himself or gotten another store employee to do it. The man in the workshop remembered how my grandfather would slip a $20 bill to people for no reason at all, just because he could. By all accounts, he noted, Leo had continued to feel an obligation and a love for the people of Jefferson Street corridor, even after he had moved away. But what he had likely never noticed, and what I had never seen until that day, was that he and his commercial activity were among the forces that kept people trapped too. Not the same way as institutional racism, perhaps, but trapped nonetheless. He had not been a bad person, but he had been more complicated than I had ever imagined. He had been a man who could count among his closest friends several black folks, a man who had supported in every respect the civil rights movement, a man whose proximity to the black community had probably done much for me in terms of making me comfortable in non-white settings. But at the same time, he had been a man whose wealth, what there was of it, had been accumulated on the backs or at least the livers of black people. Neither his personal friendships nor his political commitments had changed any of that. This structural dynamic had provided him privilege, and it had been my own privilege that had rendered me for so long unable to see it. Looking backwards in time, then, it becomes possible to see whiteness playing out all along the history of my family, dating back hundreds of years. The ability to come to America in the first place, the ability to procure land once here, and the ability to own other human beings while knowing that you would never be owned yourself, all depended on European ancestry. What does your family's past and what does my family's past have to do with me? When it comes to understanding the centrality of race and racism in the society of my birth, perhaps this is the most important point of all. I was born just a few hours and half a state away from Memphis, where 6 months earlier to the day Dr. King had been murdered. My mom was 13 weeks pregnant at the time and had been working that evening when King stepped onto the balcony outside of room 306 of the Lorraine Motel, only to be felled a few seconds later by an assassin's bullet. Upon hearing the news, the managers of the department store where she was employed decided to close shop. A minor riot had occurred in Nashville the year before of King's assassination, and so whites were on guard and on high alert for signs of trouble. That I may have experienced my mother's bodily reaction to King's murder, as well as the killing of Bobby Kennedy 2 months later, may or may not mean anything. Whether or not cell memory and the experiences of one's parents can be passed to the child as a result of trauma, thereby influencing the person that a child is to become, is something that will never likely be proven one way or another. But even discounting cell memory, and even if we disregard the possibility that a mother may somehow transmit knowledge to her child during gestation, my experience with race predated my birth, if simply because being born to a white family meant certain things about the experiences I was likely to have once born, where I would live, what jobs and education my family was likely to have had, and where I would go to school. On the third day of my life, I most certainly experienced race, however oblivious I was to it at the time. When my parents and I moved to an apartment complex above the mentioned Green Hills community, it was a complex that 4 years after its completion had still never had a tenant of color. Very much not by accident, but in we went because it was affordable and a step up from a smaller apartment my folks had been living in prior to that time. More than that, in we went because we could, just as we could have gone into any apartment complex anywhere in Nashville. So at least as early as Monday, October 7, 1968, before the last remnants of my umbilical cord had fallen off, I was officially experiencing what it meant to be white. I say this not to suggest any guilt for having inherited the legacy. It is surely not my fault that I was born, as with so many others, into a social status over which I had little control. But this is hardly the point. And regardless of our own direct culpability for the system or lack thereof, the simple, incontestable fact is that we all have to deal with the residue of past actions. We love. Few people refuse to accept money or property from others who bequeath such things to them upon death out of a concern that they wouldn't want to accept something they hadn't earned. We love to accept things we didn't earn, such as inheritance, but we have a problem taking responsibility for the things that have benefited us while harming others. Just as a house or farm left to you upon the death of a parent is an asset that you get to use, so too is racial privilege. And if you get to use an asset, you have to pay the debt accumulated, which allowed the asset to exist in the first place. In the end, the past really isn't the biggest issue. Putting aside the historic crime of slavery, the only slightly lesser crime of segregation, the genocide of indigenous persons, and the generations-long head start for whites, we still would need to deal with the issues of racism and white privilege, because discrimination and privilege today, irrespective of the past, are big enough problems to require our immediate concern. My own life has been more than adequate proof of this truism. It is to this life that I now turn. And so in today's reading, Tim Wise talks about discovering the benefits of his family, but he also talks about learning about some of the liabilities of his family, especially the paternal side, and finding out that, or realizing really, that his grandfather may have helped the Black community, but at the same time, he was bringing something to the Black community that would cause some detriment. And so I like the analogy at the end that he talks about, that there are things that you inherit, right, that have some benefit to it. But even in that inheritance, there could be some debts owed or some debts needing to be paid. And I think he sees white privilege and race privilege as that good example, as saying, yes, these are ways that my race is benefiting in the United States, but here are some detriments that my race needs to account for. And as he said before, race is a social construct. It is, you know, we know that we're all one human race, but in this terms of whiteness, race becomes a social construct that puts up barriers in the way of others while allowing other people to have no restrictions in terms of their upward mobility. I also want to say that he brought out a very good point about neighborhoods. And if you look at, and I would encourage you to kind of just do a scan of your neighborhood when you're driving through. A lot of times you can tell where you are or what kind of income level is there in your neighborhood by what's located in your neighborhood. So even as you drive through your own neighborhood, I would encourage you to kind of look around and ask yourself, how many liquor stores are there? How many abortion clinics are there? How many health clinics are there? How many rent-to-own places are there? Does your community have a fresh market? How many grocery stores does your community have? How many schools does your community have? Does your community have a prison or a juvenile detention center? All of these things can give you a clue as to what is going on in your community and whether or not your community has been targeted as a place for predatory practices or debt accumulation. So I'll put it this way. If you have more liquor stores or more corner stores or more payday loan stores than you do grocery stores and schools, that's a problem. All right. So I hope that you got something out of today's lesson. Today was very short because we're closing out a section. Tomorrow we will begin a new section called Awakenings, where Tim goes a little bit further back into his childhood and tries to understand these lessons of race, these lessons of privilege, even from an education, elementary school setting. So that's where we will be on tomorrow. I hope that you have a great and wonderful day. Thank you for taking time out to reflect on race with me. Take care and God bless.